So there's this article from Fightful Select that there's issues with the Hurt Syndicate in AEW, and it does talk about that MVP is pulling a lot of backstage politics to make sure the Hurt Syndicate doesn't lose. And they're saying MVP has issues with Speedball Mike Bailey, like he doesn't want him to beat Bobby Lashley or Shelton, and he doesn't want to put Jet Speed over, and then also he doesn't want FTR to beat um, Bobby Lashley and Shelton. So I have a couple of things to say about this. That first of all, in professional wrestling, wrestlers have to protect themselves. And what I mean by this was that when I think they said with Brock Lesnar, they wanted to make him like a Viking, and Paul Heyman stepped in and said no, like Brock Lesnar's more like an ass kicker type, and he saved the career of Brock Lesnar. And sometimes in AEW, you see situations like um you saw like a wrestler. I'm trying to remember his name. Like he was fighting like Brody Lee. And he was like he was like part of Jurassic Express. He was like smaller than Jungle Boy. And I can't remember his name really quickly, but the point of it is that there's been like a lot of times in AEW where you see like these smaller wrestlers try to pick fights with bigger wrestlers and whatever, really, or you try to have matches with that. Like imagine if you had like Rey Mysterio try to go one-on-one with like Braun Breaker, or imagine if you had Hornswoggle, who with luchador moves trying to go against somebody like Braun Breaker or the Big Show. Like in AEW, you're going to see a little bit more of that. You're going to see a little bit of like the smaller guy having a bit of a chance, really. And when you have people like Bobby Lashley and MVP, who's the manager of Bobby Lashley, you need to protect yourself and say, no, we're not doing that, because that's a bad look, really. Like, for example, like Speedball Mike Bailey, a few weeks ago, they had Speedball Mike Bailey and Kevin Knight ambush Bobby Lashley, and I said, oh my God, I feel like Bobby Lashley's a bit nerfed, really, because here's a guy who could lift Viscera, here's a guy who fought Brock Lesnar, and here's a guy who's done all these, like, very big power moves in WWE. Now, you're trying to have it, so, like Speedball Mike Bailey, who I believe was a cruiserweight in or an X Division wrestler in TNA Wrestling, now he's booked to kind of like be 50-50 against him, and that's not good, really. And that's one of the issues with AEW, again, like I can't remember his name, but he hung out with Jungle Boy. He was like a smaller version of him or something like that, really. And then that's not good, really. Or like how some people were talking about this week. You had Dustin Rhodes get like a tombstone pile driver onto two chairs, and he kept on going for a while. So there is a lot of that in AEW. So sometimes you have wrestlers like MVP who just say, okay, no, we're not doing this because I got to make sure Bobby Lashley, is booked really, really strong, really. You don't have a person like Commander, pin Bobby Lashley that easy, really. When you have Bobby Lashley lose, it should be against, like, as I said, like, you turn the Don Callis family into tag teams. Like, you do, like, Brian Cage and Josh Alexander, Brian Cage and Lance Archer, Josh Alexander and Konosuke Takeshita, or Kyle Fletcher and Konosuke Takeshita, really. Like, you have to have, like, these bigger body wrestlers. Or if you do something else like Brody King, and you have Brody King versus Bobby Lashley, that's a good look for Bobby Lashley because they're big body people, really. Or you do Powerhouse Hobbs versus Bobby Lashley, like that's a great big man versus big man. Or you do the Ops, Samoa Joe and Bobby Lashley versus Samoa Joe versus Bobby Lashley, or Samoa Joe and Hobbs versus Bobby Lashley and Shelton. Like, those are times where Bobby Lashley should lose if he wants to put other people over, or have a 50-50 feud type of thing. But against skinny ass Speedball Mike Bailey, Hong Kong Phooey, that's not good for him. And that's when MVP stepping in is right, really, because you also gotta understand that like I've said, the Hurt Syndicate is that faction that can really take over AEW in a good direction, really. They can be the new big villain faction versus, what they're doing with the Death Riders, where I really think they want to do blood and guts with the Death Riders, or I really think they want to do something with the Death Riders where, they extend it to Darby Allin versus the Death Riders. Or they may do something where Moxley gets the title back and then you have like a part two with it, and nobody wants to see that. But, wrestlers and managers got to protect their wrestlers. And one of the things you do is you make sure that you know who's actually going to beat them and who you're going to have good feuds with. And like I said, there is a difference between, like I said, Powerhouse Hobbs slamming the Big Show and the Big Show getting pinned by Mac. There's a difference between Powerhouse Hobbs slamming the Big Show and Max Caster and Anthony Bowens doing a segment with the Big Show and then doing a match where you have Max Caster pin the Big Show or the Big Show loses to the 5-minute best wrestler alive challenger, type of thing, really. So I think with MVP, I really feel that the biggest thing that he's doing is saying, he's not losing because we got to protect Bobby Lashley from losing to the wrong type of people. I do think FTR can beat Bobby Lashley. It looks legitimate because Dax and Cash have muscles on their body, but the problem is, and I'll say this, is that the big problem is that FTR joke around too much. They have like this stupid comedy thing like you see with the Young Bucks. So you got to make sure it's serious people. And I've even said this too, that there are other tag teams that are deserving, but they're also the Outrunners, who are a good tag team. But the problem is that they fuck around and do this 1980s silly crap, And if you want to beat Bobby Lashley, you have to have really serious and ruthless people because he's a serious and ruthless wrestler. It makes sense to have somebody like that beat him. It does not make sense to, have the Outrunners stick their tongues out, they spin around and say joke lines like "you son of a bitch" and other things like that. Because if you have that type of wrestler beat Bobby Lashley, you might as well have like the New Day shucking and jiving beat Bobby Lashley. Or you might as well have Adam Rose and the Rosebuds, all tackle Bobby Lashley, lay on top of him to help him get a pinfall type of thing, really. You get what I'm saying, really. This is why you have people like MVP and also Bobby Lashley step in and say, no, we want to make sure that's going to a legitimate person. Or Nick Wayne and that other guy with him, Kip Sabian, might become a tag team. Can you imagine Nick Wayne, skinny ass, pinning Bobby Lashley? Bobby Lashley's that type of person that would just do a military press and throw him like 10 or 6 feet in the air, just like what Yokozuna did to Macho Man. Type of thing, really. It's all that, really. Like wrestlers got to protect themselves from bad booking, and bad booking would be if you have a situation where Bobby Lashley loses to the wrong people. He needs to lose. People need to get pinfalls on him, but it has to be the right person. Like I said, do Hobbs versus Bobby Lashley at that would be the right person to beat Bobby Lashley. Or if you're going to have tag teams, it should be Josh Alexander or other wrestlers in the Don Callis family who can legitimately, have the muscles beat him, whatever. FTR, they can do that as well, really. But definitely, you got to be very careful with Bobby Lashley because you have to make sure that when somebody beats him, it doesn't hurt his legacy as well, really. And that's really the vibe that I'm getting. You don't want him, as I said, you don't want him losing to Hong Kong Phooey. In other words, skinny ass Speedball Mike Bailey, whose name is a joke about cocaine, really. So think about it. Or if you want to do the Death Riders, you do Moxley and Claudio as a tag team. Claudio, the guy who swung the Big Show. Claudio pinning Bobby Lashley's legitimate, really. So I'm kind of more on the side of MVP and Bobby Lashley with this one. Because you got to make sure that your people are protected, really. And you got to make sure that, like I said, you can do the Acclaimed beating the Hurt Syndicate. But you have them do a double team on Bobby Lashley, or Bowen's doing a power move. If you ever bring the Acclaim back together, really, that'd be the way to beat him, because you establish that they know how to do double team moves. They've been tag team for a long time, just like with FTR, really. So you have to make sure that if somebody beats Bobby Lashley, it doesn't it doesn't nerf Bobby Lashley or anything like that really. And that wrestler I was thinking about was Marco Stunt. Really, you don't want Marco Stunt beating anybody, or like if you ever form like Jurassic Express, you would want Luchasaurus beating Bobby Lashley because they're both big hulking wrestlers, so it would make sense for Luchasaurus to beat him, but you don't want to have 50-50 match with Bobby Lashley and Marco Stunt really. So I'm more on the side of Bobby Lashley protecting himself and MVP protecting Bobby Lashley from bad booking.